Growing food as activism, while food sovereignty is integral to addressing racial inequities. I'm Celina Esekawu, and I'll be focusing a lot on the food movement, specifically food sovereignty. But food sovereignty is a large conversation, and this PowerPoint in no way encompasses the complexities of race and food. I will provide some historical context to contextualize the intersections between them and provide examples of organizations working to decrease barriers and racial inequities using food production as activism. Growing food. Let's start at the basics. We'll talk about why folks grow food, and then we'll move towards some social injustices that impact communities and their ability to grow food. So first off, why do you grow food? It could be multiple reasons, right? Maybe you enjoy it, it's relaxing. It's possible you don't even grow food. It could be supplemental to your food supply. Maybe you're dependent on the food that you grow. It could be your business. It's possible that you grew up growing food. It's a family thing. And now think about what all do you need to grow food? There's a handful of things that we know for sure that we need, right? We need seeds, we need plants, we need soil, we need sunlight. But there's also a wide variety of things that maybe we don't even think about, like space, time, physical ability to actually grow food, ways to process it. It takes money, it takes tools, it takes knowledge, whether that's passed down, whether it's learned, whether it's intuitive. So all these different things are needed to grow food, but these things can also be barriers. So if we think about the food movement, right, we're really addressing the fact that not everyone has access to grow food. Not everyone has access to healthy, nutritious food. Growing food that you're actually able to consume is a privilege here in the U.S., right? So all these needs that some people are able to meet very quickly, don't even think about, can also be barriers, and barriers for more people than they are for other people. So a solution, right? If we know that we have all these different barriers, what can a solution be for communities and neighborhoods that don't have access to grow food or may not have a consistent supply of food? What do we think of? Da-da-da. Community gardens, right? I love community gardens. I work for one. I'm all for it. So community gardens make growing food more affordable. Sometimes you can get more support if you have a coordinator there, or maybe gardener to gardener support. You have access to resources. Hopefully you do, like water, soil, seeds. There may be hands-on educational opportunities. They may bring in professionals to help folks with growing food and helping them process it, so on and so forth. And then also it provides the space. But the mission, the purpose, and the guidelines vary tremendously between different community garden sites. Oftentimes they're temporary or contract limited. So depending on the agreement with the business organization or with the city, sometimes these community gardens aren't there for long, maybe just a couple of years, and they have to renegotiate, or maybe, hopefully, they're long-term. But they don't always address the systemic issues related to the barriers that I mentioned before, right? And when I mention barriers, I'm talking about this stuff. Systemic issues include, but are not limited to, racism, environmental injustice, economic wealth gap, housing crisis, urban density, lack of land access, education inequities, health disparities. All these different things, these major issues impact a community's or a person's ability to grow food. So here are some examples of some issues that are impacting communities when we talk about those big systemic issues. But for me, it's directly related to people's ability and access to grow food and even access to have healthy food in their community. So we have a Deepwood dump in Dallas. Maybe some people have heard of it. It was new to me. Found out about this about a year ago after I moved back from Colorado. And it's a huge scar blitz in DFW, right? But these things happen in multiple communities and are happening right now. So here's a quote here from Green Source. The Trinity River Audubon Center now sits where the largest illegal landfill in the state of Texas once operated, located in a predominantly Black neighborhood in South Dallas. The 85-acre dump not only leaked toxic chemicals, it caught on fire twice and burned for several months, basking the neighborhood in smog. This was right here in Dallas. So it was 2 million cubic yards of trash. For 25 years, the city of Dallas ignored the illegal dump site. The community consisted of middle-class Black families in southeast Dallas, really close to Pleasant Grove, if not in Pleasant Grove. The residents ended up suing the city and citing racial discrimination and environmental injustice. In 1999, the city was held liable and was ordered to clean up, quote-unquote, clean up the site. And I put clean up in quotation marks because there is no way, right? So the trash that was on site, right near these people's homes, outside of their backyards, was plastic, cars, tires, paint barrels, roofing materials, and tons of toxic materials. And so there is a beautiful documentary called Out of Deepwood that I recommend people to watch. It's about 22 minutes. And it explains this whole ordeal and really centers the people in this community and the fight, decades-long fight that they were up against with the city of Dallas. And finally, there was change in the community. There's the Trinity River Audubon Center. So that center is designed around the consolidated waste, right? There is no way. And it still releases methane. So the city of Dallas got out of paying millions of dollars from taking the trash off site. And again, it would have just gone into the land somewhere else. And I wouldn't necessarily say that the center is the best solution or what have you. However, these people are still feeling the impacts of this dump site because it's still there. So if you can imagine this community here experiencing this huge injustice and environmental injustice, not only was the land contaminated, the air was contaminated, right? And this is valuable green space, whether it's beautifying, whether it's cleaning the air, was disrupted by this trash dump. And so to me, this is directly related to these people's ability to thrive and to have healthy food in their community, right? Another community that experiences a lot of systemic injustice is Sand Branch. In addition to no running water, not even well water is safe to drink. There's no sewer service, there's no internet access. Folks burn their trash because nobody's coming to collect it. So this community is still experiencing huge injustices related to toxic soil, related to the inability to have clean running water. A lot of people know about Flint, Michigan, but this is happening in our backyards and in our communities as well. So this community is historically African American. Black people moved there, I believe, in the early 1900s. There's a lot of articles about Sand Branch, so I encourage you to look up more historical information about it. And they're mostly working class Black families, and it's in unincorporated Dallas. The community is surrounded by mines and salvage yards, which has polluted the area since the 1950s. And the community was dependent on well water since the 1900s, but that became contaminated in the 80s and 90s. So because it's incorporated Dallas, they didn't have access to the clean water as Dallas residents had. They're just left there to fend for themselves. So they're actually located right next to a wastewater treatment plant, but they don't see any benefits of that. Their water is not getting cleaned. So the drinking water is either donated, it's brought in, or it's collected. It's kind of hard to grow food, right, when your water is contaminated. And there have been talks over the years in creating a sustainable community and using regenerative practices, specifically in Sand Branch, so they can have greater access to water. But again, that's so complicated, and these communities experience multiple injustices. So you can't just solve a problem with just creating a community garden or bringing in bees, and it's multi-layered, right? Lastly, I wanted to include Standing Rock, which has impacted the Dakotas and several indigenous groups here in the U.S. And so this may be familiar to some of y'all, definitely is familiar to me. It really took off in 2016. So for 4 years, water protectors have protected the project that threatens sacred native lands and could contaminate their water supply from the Missouri River. This is the longest river in North America. Let's talk a little bit about DAPL. So the Dakota Access Pipeline costs $3.7 billion to transport oil across the cultural lands of the Lakota Nation. So for many people, this is considered cultural genocide. These are sacred lands, ancestral lands that some indigenous people have used, and also it's impacting their water supply, could potentially impact their water supply, and not only for those communities directly using the water, but it also flows downward, right? So other people can be impacted. #NoDAPL, reunited conversation around indigenous rights, decolonization, environmental racism. As of July 2020, Dakota Access Pipeline was ordered to cease the project. And of course, they're combating this and saying it's going to cost millions and millions and millions of dollars to stop the project, to take the oil out of the pipe, so on and so forth. But it is considered a small win for the water protectors and folks that are aligned with the No DAPL movement. So with that being said, there are people who want to change these oppressive systems. This leads to activism. Activism gets thrown around a lot, so I'll break it down a little bit. The dictionary definition is a doctrine or practice that emphasizes direct, vigorous action, especially in support of or opposition to one side of a controversial issue. It's a broad term about an action to bring about systemic change or maintain the status quo. A lot of people think of protests, boycotts, petition signing, and lobbying being forms of activism. However, activism can show up in a lot of ways. So would you say that this person sitting down is being an activist? What about these women in this classroom? Or these groups? Or this group on the farm eating some food? Of course they're activists. We have Benjamin Cowan staging a sit-in Florida. This act of sitting is activism because he's sitting in a place where he's not supposed to be. This is a white-only place. This photo was taken from Malala's site. She's an activist for the education of young women. In some places, in different parts of the world, it's dangerous or illegal for women to get an education. And these folks here are a part of the Black Dirt Farm Collective throughout the East Coast, specifically in Maryland. I drove around for hours on my Black Farm tour in 2018 looking for one of their farms in Maryland, and I couldn't find it. It was pretty elusive, and I'm sure intentionally so, because land is associated with freedom, independence, and empowerment. Land has been used as a tool of oppression by white people perpetuating systemic issues due to forced labor on the land, stealing land, and denying land access and rights to different groups of color. This collective is reclaiming their right to be on the land, grow food, and heal the land. These everyday acts can be forms of activism. They are exercising the rights that they have been denied. Before we get in any deeper, I wanted to highlight some of the food movement terms that get used a lot during these conversations. These are my personal definitions and how I tend to use the words more often, but they can be used in various ways and have a variety of different contexts. First, we have food justice. For me, this is most aligned with ensuring food access for communities that are underserved. And then we have food sovereignty, which was coined by Via Campesina in 1996. Definitely look them up. It refers to not only access to food, but control over the food system, meaning folks can produce, sell, distribute, organize, and educate each other in their communities about food without the exploitation of labor, low wages, and international control and dispossession of the land, and so many other things. It's basically food for and by the community. Then we have land sovereignty. I associate land sovereignty with the right to occupy land and have access to the resources for a land-based existence. For me, land sovereignty centers Native American and Indigenous land rights and acknowledges the dispossession and displacement of them from their ancestral lands. So these photos show how the Manifest Destiny doctrine was destructive to Indigenous peoples. The picture on the right is promoting, primarily to white settlers, the buying of land that Indigenous people were removed from at pretty low wages or at pretty low prices. And below is a representation of modernization. Columbia is the central figure, which she's a personification of the U.S., and she's shown leading civilization westward with white American settlers. She's shown bringing the light from the east to the west with stringing telegraph wire and holding the school books to instill knowledge, and is highlighting different stages of economic activity, all while Native peoples are in the dark, being forced further west, along with the buffalo herds and bears. Some people are moving away from the term food deserts because deserts are a naturally occurring ecosystem thriving with life and resources, but communities without food isn't natural or thriving. It's human-made. The term food desert is also an attempt to describe the community lacking in resources without naming the systemic issues that cause it. People use the term food apartheid, intentionally politicized, to better describe the layered inequities that create such communities, especially for communities of color. Food security for food access. Food security is the measure of food access over a period of time. Then we have community resiliency. That's the measure of the sustainability of a community to utilize available resources to respond to, withstand, and recover from adverse situations. Obviously, food is something that we all need, so food resiliency gets talked about a lot within the food movement, right? Because we can be more resilient if we know how to grow food, if we have access to food that is going to help us thrive and survive. So let's look at the statistics. There's huge disparities in the statistics when we look at producers. These are stats from the USDA 2017. They've changed over the years, so this is designated for producers. They no longer have stats for specifically for farmers or landowners. They may, but this is what I found that is related to this topic in particular. So if we look at these charts here, we see that the Latinx community, of them actually own farms, but 83% of them are skilled laborers. There's a huge discrepancy, right, with our food system when it comes to who actually is growing the food, picking the food, processing the food, harvesting the food, and who actually owns the farms that the food is coming from. Large part of that 83% are migrant farm workers, U.S. citizens, immigrants from the U.S. or from outside of the U.S. When we look at farmers and land ownership, growing food, people who are growing food, the Latinx community did see the largest increase of any other group over the past 10 years. Then we go to the Black community. As producers, they're at 1.3% and slowly increasing. I mean, that's just a little blip. And just because you're a producer doesn't mean that you own the farm, doesn't mean that you, quote unquote, own the land. You're producing the food. So these statistics are slightly skewed, but it's worth highlighting that producers, farmers, landowners, those are three different terms. And so we have female identified producers, and there's a huge disparity there too. If we look at the chart that is on the right, we see that males make up 64% of the total producers, and females make up 36%. If we're just looking at the binary, that's what gets recorded anyway, but we also know that there are queer people and trans people who are farming and who are producers as well, but those statistics are not here. But the female producers are on the increase. Average age is 57 years old, and then the majority of producers, surprise, surprise, are white. So if you look at the chart below, it has that 3.2 million producers are white. And you have this visual representation of how many of the 5% make up folks of color. And just for kicks, I just wanted to do a pie graph just to see, just another visual to see what this really looks like. It's pretty ridiculous, right? Numbers are off just slightly. And then some people will say, well, there's a great opportunity for producers of color, farmers of color to get in on this. However, there's a lot of reasons why this disparity exists. It is not just because people are not interested in growing food. We are interested in growing food. There are many things that have led to this disparity, and we'll talk about some of those. So genocide. A lot of us are aware of, maybe acknowledge the genocide that indigenous people have experienced. Statistics are hard to come by just because this happened so long ago, but we know with colonization, a large part of the indigenous population decreased. The statistic I was able to find was that the indigenous population decreased by 80% by 1990 throughout the Americas, so beyond just the U.S. And we know that the impacts of genocide are still relevant, right? Genocide comes in the form of disease, mass killings, cultural genocide, removal, forced labor, and even other ways. We know that enslavement causes the disparity, right? Because African Americans were forced to labor the land without any ability to accrue wealth and resources for over 250 years. There was forced migration and dispossession. We have a lot of policies throughout the history of the U.S. that have removed Native people from their lands. Then we have things like the Homestead Act that really encourage white settlers to populate the land at low cost after the forced removal of Native peoples. And these disparities, I'm just providing some examples. This in no way is all-encompassing of why there's a disparity between growers and farmers and landowners. These are just some that I wanted to highlight. So loss of resources and displacement. Black land loss is very real, and there is a movement happening in the Black community where we are trying to regain this land that is considered heir property, where a lot of people have access to this land, and then because people are not caring for it, it just gets passed down generationally, and we end up losing it, right? Because the family member's like, I'm just going to sell this piece or what have you. And so for multiple reasons, Black people have lost the land that they did have access to. So in 1910, Blacks owned 14 million acres, and currently they own less than 1% of the folks that own. They own 1% of the land that is owned by folks today. In this time where Black folks did have a lot of land, some of them were able to access land through the Homestead Act and through some of the other programs. They were able to establish Black freedom communities and freedom towns, like Quakertown in Denton is one right now. The huge big park in Denton is actually built on Quakertown. That's its own story. Please look it up. We have Wheatville in Austin. That was considered a Black community, well started by one Black landowner. And then Deep Ellum was actually a Black community. So I encourage you to look up those histories. And we know in regards to loss of resource and displacement that the Japanese communities, they experience internment. A lot of these Japanese folks were actually farm owners and landowners. And so since they were interned, a lot of their land and the positions that they had on these farms were transferred over to white farmers and white laborers. So they were able to receive reparations of $106 billion due to their loss of resources. So terrorism is a reason why there are such huge disparities. So there was a great migration. 6 million African Americans moved to the north between 1916 and 1970. Lynchings, intimidation, and segregation was enforced in the South, and so many of them moved north, not only for work and opportunity, but to get away from the killings that were happening in their community. And in that process, you leave the land, you leave your family. There's so many things that are lost in that. And we also have discriminatory laws. This is just a couple of so many that have excluded groups from land ownership, fair wages, loans, and financial support. So I cite a few different cases where the first one is Pickford and Glickman, where Black farmers were rewarded $1.15 billion because they were denied loans from the federal government. There's a similar case with Native and Indigenous farmers that happened, and luckily they were able to receive some compensation as well, and it started the Native American Agricultural Fund. We have migrant farm workers, which I mentioned before, an Operation quote-unquote wetback, a discriminatory term to specifically talk about Mexican and Mexican-American people. And this really is about the injustices for migrant farm workers of mostly Latin American descent. They have no access to health care or protection or U.S. rights. There's a low life expectancy for migrant farm workers. The average is 49 years versus the U.S. average is 77 years. So being a migrant farm worker, you're working for someone. You're not necessarily owning the land, right? You may not fall into that category of producer. You're constantly on the move. It's hard to buy land, be a farmer, right? If your existence is determined on moving around and doing this labor for other people. And in 1913, we have the California alien land law, which prohibited aliens, quote unquote aliens, ineligible for citizenship from owning agricultural land. This affected non-European immigrants, specifically Chinese, Indian, Japanese, Korean immigrant farmers. This was around the same time as internment. Then we have assimilation. So the Native Americans, along with other groups as well, experienced boarding schools, which resulted in a loss of cultural knowledge, which is deeply rooted with the land. The impact on subsequent generations is vast, right? So these things that I mentioned, plus many, 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 many more, result in lack of assets and property to hand down to family members, right? So you end up being economically disadvantaged. There's a loss of culture, of knowledge, and connection with the land. Then there's a negative association with growing, with farming, and land-based work. So many of these things make it so if you're a child and you see your parent experiencing this, or if you directly experience this, why would you want to work on the land, right? Makes it hard to continue what the previous generation did if you have all these setbacks, and then your family was either displaced from the land, was forced to work on the land, was told that they can't grow food. This, for me, these are some of the biggest problems that we face within the food movement, right? Because we understand, as a person of color, we understand that there's this huge disparity in who's growing food and who has control over the food. So now I want to highlight some organizations that are doing really important work in the communities to decrease the barriers and inequities that people of color experience related to the farm movement. So Soulfire Farms is really close to my heart. I did a farmers immersion course with them in 2018, and I know a lot of folks who have come out of their trainings and who are associated with Soulfire Farms. They are a BIPOC-centered community farm committed to ending racism and injustice in the food system. Just in case you don't know what BIPOC is, it's Black and Indigenous and people of color. So they do this in a handful of ways, and I've just pulled out some things that can be found on their website. As far as regenerate, they use Afro-Indigenous practices. So they integrate using polycultures, plant medicine, pasture-raised livestock. Mobilize, they collaborate with a variety of different food justice networks to advance the food sovereignty movement. So in seeding food sovereignty, they want to equip people through having immersions and workshops about land-based skills to reclaim leadership in the food system. So when it comes to uprooting racism, they provide land access. They're on, I think, 50-plus acres in upstate New York, and they want to undo the industrial agricultural damage to the earth by integrating some of these Afro-Indigenous practices. And they want to end the land-based oppression, or at least heal the land-based oppression that so many people of color have experienced. We have Philly Urban Creators. This is another place that I visited on my Black Farm tour. This is the same year, 2018. I went up to Soulfire, actually stopped at some Native American reservations, and then after Soulfire, I came back down and stopped here at Philly Urban Creators. Some of them have gone through Soulfire programs as well. And so they really focus on using food, art, and education as tools to nurture resilience, self-determination, and equity in communities. So how their program started in central Philadelphia was within 3 years, they transformed a trash 2-acre vacant lot into the Life Do Grow Farm and Creative Sanctuary. So they're increasing land access. They are incorporating environmental stewardship. increasing community resiliency, and providing economic opportunity for artists and growers. Their impact is they've created 12 gardens. They employ local youth. They curate creative spaces and support local artists. There are some statistics that show that violent crime has decreased in their area, and they're investing in minority-owned businesses. Right now, they're in a transition period. So there was some, obviously for those who've worked in nonprofits, there are some unsustainable things that were happening in the nonprofit realm that was not conducive to what they were, the goals that they were trying to achieve. So now they're in transition and trying to work in a model by offering memberships to access space and utilize resources as a co-working space. So they're trying to figure out what funding from the community looks like versus being dependent on foundations and external grants. Next, we have Oak Cliff Veggie Project. I really appreciate this project because not only does it work with the communities where I'm from, they also distribute food and educate people in those places as well. They establish gardens in neighborhoods, at churches or apartment complexes. They distribute food with the help of many volunteers, and volunteers are able to work in the garden beds at the distribution sites and learn a variety of different growing techniques and share their experience. The harvest from the gardens go directly to the community. So they really emphasize education and serving these underserved communities in the Oak Cliff area, and they also have partnerships in other areas outside of Oak Cliff trying to help other organizations and apartments start their own community gardens that serve the immediate community there. Project goal is to cultivate stronger, healthier, and more self-reliant communities through direct food access, land reclamation, and strengthening the network of resources. The Grow House is an organization that I learned a lot of in regards to permaculture. A lot of our permaculture sessions were at the Grow House, and this is in central Denver. And the Grow House is a space to create a community-driven and neighborhood-based food system by serving as a hub for food distribution, production, education, and economic opportunity. So this community has experienced a lot of environmental racism. Grow House itself is 20,000 square foot hydro and aquaponics greenhouse that was founded to combat the environmental racism in the community. This community is adjacent to a lot of factories, and so there's air and soil pollution, which is the primary reason why they decided to integrate hydro and aquaponics there. The soil is contaminated. They are experiencing food apartheid, like in some of the other organizations I mentioned before. They are at risk of the area being gentrified. Actually, they've been experiencing gentrification, and even more is coming down the pike with an expansion of the highway that's there. And so there's a lot of displacement that has been happening. And this community is primarily Latinx, both generationally. Families have been there for generations, and some newer Latinx folks have moved into the community. So this community is at risk in Denver. And so their impact has been culturally relevant food, and they have a food market with a sliding scale. So if you live in the Globalville, Elyria, Swansea area, you pay a lower price in the food market than someone who lives outside of those zip codes. And then there's an educational space for youth and adults. And there's teaching and skill building for the Promotores program. And Promotores is a local community leadership program. There's food production for the on-site market. So the food that gets grown in the greenhouse goes directly to the market, if not gets distributed out into the community. So moving forward, this is also an organization that's in a state of flux. They found out March 2020, great timing, that the building needed to close due to structural damage that really can't be corrected, not with where they are financially. And so they have transitioned to off-site programming due to COVID-19. They are currently distributing emergency food boxes. So the hope is that Grow House will transition to some type of organization that can meet the immediate needs of the community, at least for the time being, and possibly they'll have another greenhouse or growing operation in the future. There are just so many things impacting this community immediately that their focus is to make sure that their community is taken care of right now. Here are some resources. I try not to inundate you with too many different things, but I have videos that I would really encourage you to look at that talk more in depth about some things that I just highlighted in this PowerPoint. And here are some books that are close to my heart. And then here are some websites if you're interested in exploring or even supporting financially some of these organizations. I encourage you to do that. Again, I'm Celina Esekawu, and I'm the HSC Community Garden and Wellness Coordinator. Please contact me if you'd like to talk more about how we can address some of these racial inequities through work in the food movement. This is just an overview of how systemic issues impact us and our community's engagement in the food system.